Okay, strap in, everyone. We are taking a deep dive today, and it's into something that affects us all every single day. We're talking cognitive biases.
You got it, and you've given me, wow, a ton of material to work with. Looks like someone's ready for a crash course in how to outsmart their own brain.
Oh, absolutely. It's like you said, these biases, they're behind so many decisions we make, from the stuff we buy to, heck, even who we trust. So yeah, a user manual for my brain. Sign me up.
I like that. The user manual for your brain.
But where on earth do we even start with all this? I mean, there's so much here.
Well, let's kick things off with a bias called survivorship bias.
Survivorship bias.
Yeah, it's the sneaky thing our brains do, where they focus on the winners, the successes, but completely ignore all the people who didn't make it.
Oh, I think I get it. So kind of like you only see the tip of the iceberg, but not all the stuff hidden underneath.
Exactly. Think about a cemetery.
Okay, this took a dark turn fast, but I'm listening.
Well, cemeteries, right. They're full of folks who never got rich, never became famous. We don't see their stories, so we tend to think, well, our odds of succeeding are way higher than they actually are.
Okay, yeah. That's pretty sobering when you put it like that. It actually reminds me of something we saw in the research about those MBA programs.
Oh, right. MBA programs. They love to brag about their graduate salaries, but is that the whole picture? Probably not, right?
No, definitely not. I mean, those who go for an MBA, they're often already, high achievers. So are they successful because of the degree itself? Not necessarily.
Exactly. It's what we call selection bias. Like assuming everyone who buys a lottery ticket will win the jackpot. You got to zoom out and see the whole picture.
Man, and that makes me think about like all those rags to riches stories. We love those, right? We focus on the glamorous part, the success, but totally forget about all the struggles, the failures behind it. No wonder we feel this crazy pressure to, make it.
Yep, it's a trap, a mental trap we all fall into. But how do we fight it? This survivorship bias. We need to actively seek out the stories of those who didn't make it, those who struggled, biographies of entrepreneurs who went bankrupt, stories of artists who never got any recognition.
Okay, so look beyond the highlight reel, the success stories.
You got it. It gives you a way more realistic view of the world, maybe even take some of that pressure off.
Wow, this is great stuff. So what other mental traps are out there? What else do we need to watch out for?
Okay, let's dive into social proof. Imagine you're, I don't know, on the African savannah, and everyone around you starts running.
Lion, I should probably run too, right?
Right. It's instinct. In a dangerous situation, you follow the crowd. Problem is, this same instinct can mess us up in modern life.
Oh, interesting. So this is why like people buy into fads even if they seem totally ridiculous.
Then go. Fashion trends, those crazy stock market bubbles, even those, what do they call those viral challenges online. We see everyone doing it, so it must be right? Even if it makes no sense.
Oh man, that's so true. I remember I bought those neon green sneakers a few years back just because everyone else was wearing them. Not my best fashion choice.
We've all been there. But how do we avoid this social proof trap? Simple. Question your assumptions. Ask yourself, am I doing this because it's actually good for me, or am I just following the herd? Basic question, but super powerful.
Am I following the herd? I'm going to write that down, seriously. Okay, what's the next bias waiting for us? What's up next?
Let's talk reciprocity. That deep urge we all have to return favors. Great for society, right? But it can be used against us. There's this story, right, about a screw supplier who would take potential clients to, like, baseball games,
I see where this is going. Wine and dine them, then hit them with the sales pitch.
Exactly. And a month later, when those clients needed screws, guess who they felt obligated to buy from?
The guy who took them to the game, even if it wasn't the best deal.
Yep, they felt like they owed him something. It's a subtle kind of manipulation, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like that time I got a free trial of that streaming service, then felt like I had to subscribe even though I barely used it.
We've all been there. The point is, be aware of this reciprocity thing. Before taking a gift or a favor, ask, are there strings attached? And when you're making decisions, make sure you're not just being swayed by a feeling of obligation.
Man, this is insightful. I'm starting to see these biases everywhere now. So what's next? What other blind spots do we have?
Let's talk confirmation bias. Our tendency to, look for information that confirms our beliefs, and we just ignore stuff that contradicts us.
Oh, this one's huge, especially online. People gravitate toward news sources that just echo their views, even if those sources aren't exactly reliable.
It's like building an echo chamber where you never hear anything that challenges your views.
Ooh.
Super dangerous, right?
Yeah.
because it stops us from actually learning, from growing. One of the sources that used a pretty striking phrase, murder your darlings.
Murder your darlings. That sounds a bit extreme, doesn't it?
It's a metaphor. It means challenge your most cherished beliefs. Actively look for evidence that goes against what you think. Might feel uncomfortable, sure, but it's crucial if you want to be intellectually honest, you know?
So it's like a workout for your beliefs.
Exactly.
Okay, challenge accepted. But how do we even start to, murder our darlings?
It all starts with knowing your biases. What's one thing you believe strongly in? Now go find information that challenges that belief. Read articles from the opposing side, talk to people who disagree with you. You might be surprised at what you discover.
Powerful stuff. I can already feel my brain getting a workout. What other biases are hiding out there in our minds?
Okay, let's tackle the contrast effect. It's all about how we judge value based on comparisons, not, absolutes. Think about all those sales signs we see everywhere.
Oh, love a good sale.
We all do. But often, those sales are tricking us with this contrast effect. Let's say you see a product marked down from $100 to $70. Seems like a steal, right? But a product that's always been $70, well, that's the same price, but doesn't feel as good.
So we're not judging the price, we're judging the discount.
Exactly. We're comparing, not looking at the actual value.
Man, it's like marketers are playing chess with our minds, huh?
They kind of are. So how do we win this game? Focus on what something is actually worth, not just the discount. Ask, would I buy this even if it wasn't on sale? If the answer is no, well, you're probably being tricked by the contrast effect.
Wow, this is eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way.
That's the first step to making smarter decisions, right? Ready for another challenge?
Hit me. I'm feeling like, I don't know, a cognitive ninja in training.
Okay, then let's talk about availability bias. This is our tendency to think things are more likely to happen just because we can easily remember them, because they were dramatic or vivid. Like, think about news coverage of plane crashes.
Oh, yeah. Those are always big news, even though they're thankfully pretty rare.
Right. They're rare, but they get so much attention that we start to think, oh, man, flying is way more dangerous than it really is.
This is reminding me of one of the articles talked about a guy who thought all of Manhattan was super safe because his buddy never locked his apartment, even on vacation, and never got robbed. Talk about anecdotal evidence.
That's it. That's availability bias.
Yeah.
Judging a whole city's safety based on one guy's, well, pretty careless behavior. We're focusing on one memorable story instead of the actual statistics.
So it's like judging a book by its cover, but for, life or death situations.
Exactly. To fight this availability bias, we got to remember those vivid examples can really distort how we see things. Instead of relying on one story, look for the data, the real statistics, to get a clearer picture.
I'm starting to see, my brain loves a good story, even if it's not the whole truth. It's like we're wired for drama.
And that takes us right to our next bias, story bias. Our brains crave stories, even if they simplify things too much. We'd rather have a good story than, I don't know, a spreadsheet full of numbers, even if that story isn't completely accurate.
That's so true. It reminds me of what we read about advertising. Like, telling a story around a product is way more effective than just listing features,
Absolutely. Remember that famous Google ad, the one about the couple who fell in love in Paris?
Yeah.
Beautiful story, right?
Yeah.
Emotionally engaging. But it told us nothing about, what Google actually does. But we felt something, and that's what sticks with us.
Yeah. It's like those charity commercials, They tug at our heartstrings, but are we really making a rational decision about donating?
Exactly. The takeaway here is look beyond the story. Ask yourself, what are the cold, hard facts? Don't let a compelling narrative cloud your judgment.
Man, this deep dive is like a masterclass in critical thinking. What other mental pitfalls are out there?
Okay, let's unpack chauffeur knowledge.
Yeah.
This is all about the difference between truly knowing something and just being able to, parrot information. It's like, imagine a chauffeur who drives a scientist to all these conferences. He hears all the lectures, but does he actually understand the science? Not really.
So it's like being able to talk the talk, but not walk the walk.
Exactly. Like someone who can quote all the financial jargon, but has no clue how to actually invest their money.
Yeah.
Or someone who can list historical facts, but doesn't get the context, the real meaning behind them.
Oh, man. I've definitely met a few of those chauffeurs in my time. How do you, spot the difference? How can you tell if someone actually knows their stuff or if they're just, putting on a show?
Ask questions. Lots of them.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to challenge someone's expertise. If they can't explain things simply or answer your questions thoughtfully, well, they might just be relying on show for knowledge. And be honest with yourself too. Are there areas where you're just parroting information without truly understanding it?
Ouch. Yeah, that hits a little close to home. I've definitely been there. Okay, so what's next on our bias hit list? What else should we be on the lookout for?
Let's talk about the illusion of control. This is our tendency to believe, we have way more control over things than we actually do. Like, um, picture this. A guy wearing a red hat insists it keeps giraffes away, even though there are no giraffes anywhere near him.
Okay, that's hilarious, but also kind of sad. We all want to feel like we're in charge, right? Especially when things feel out of control.
Right. It's comforting.
Uh-huh.
But this illusion, it can lead to some risky behavior. Gamblers, for example, often think they have some system to beat the odds, even though gambling is all about chance. Or investors who think they can perfectly time the market, when really, stock prices are unpredictable.
So, how do we break free from this illusion of control? How do we stop kidding ourselves?
Acknowledge the role of chance, plain and simple. We can't control everything. Focus on what you can control. Your effort, your decisions, your attitude, and, be ready to adapt when things don't go according to plan.
This is like a crash course in like stoicism, isn't it? What other biases are we going to uncover today?
Let's move on to incentive super response tendency. It's the idea that people respond to incentives, rewards, but sometimes in ways we don't expect. Think about loyalty programs, those things that give you points for, like buying coffee or
Oh,
whatever.
I'm all about those loyalty programs. I mean, I once got a free coffee mug just for buying lattes.
Right. We love rewards. But incentives can backfire. One of the sources talked about CEO pay transparency. The idea was to keep salaries reasonable, but what happened? CEOs just started comparing themselves to each other and demanding even more money.
So even well-intentioned incentives can have like unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The lesson here is be aware of how incentives shape behavior, both the good and the bad. And when you're, designing any kind of reward system, think about the unintended consequences.
Wow, this deep dive is really making me think about all these hidden forces that shape how we act.
And we're just scratching the surface, ready for another cognitive bias.
Bring it on. I'm feeling like I can handle anything at this point.
Okay, then let's talk about regression to the mean. It's the idea that, things tend to even out over time. Extreme events are usually followed by more average ones, like that saying, what goes up must come down.
Okay, yeah. But how does that play out in like real life?
Okay, imagine you're a baseball player, right? You hit a home run your first time at bat. Are you going to hit another one your next time up? Probably not, right?
Probably not. Even the best hitters, they have slumps sometimes.
Exactly. Regression to the mean in action, we tend to overestimate how important those extreme events are, both the good ones and the bad ones.
That reminds me, one of the things we read about performance reviews, it said that if you like really praise someone for doing an amazing job, their next performance is probably going to be closer to average.
Perfect example. And it works the other way, too. Harsh criticism after a bad performance.
Hmm.
Well, their next one's probably going to be closer to average as well. It's not that the praise or criticism is useless. It's just that performance naturally goes up and down over time.
So how do we not get tricked by this regression to the mean thing? How do we stay level-headed?
Just recognize that extreme events, they usually balance out over time. Don't overreact to those outliers, the super good or the super bad ones. Look for patterns over time to get a real sense of someone's abilities or their performance.
It's just a good reminder to like stay grounded, not get too carried away by the highs and lows.
Exactly. So are you ready to tackle another bias?
Absolutely. I'm on a roll today. Bring on the next one.
All right, let's talk about the paradox of choice. This is the idea that having too many options can actually make us less happy. Think about trying to pick a movie on Netflix.
Oh, don't even get me started. I spend more time scrolling than actually watching.
Right, we've all been there. The paradox of choice basically says that too many options can lead to analysis paralysis, less satisfaction, even regret.
So less is more when it comes to making decisions.
Often, yeah. There was this study. They set up a jam tasting booth at a grocery store. 24 flavors. Only 3% of people bought something. But with just 6 flavors, 30% bought a jar.
Whoa, that's a huge difference. So how do we escape this paradox of choice? How do we stop being overwhelmed?
Keep it simple. Make a short list, your top choices. Don't be afraid to say no to options that don't really excite you. Quality over quantity.
I'm definitely going to try that. What other biases are lurking out there? What else should we be aware of?
Let's talk about the liking bias. It's our tendency to be more persuaded by people we like, even if their arguments are weak. Think about those really charismatic salespeople or politicians.
Oh man, I am so susceptible to that. I once bought a timeshare just because the salesperson was so friendly and, well, convincing. What a mistake.
We've all been there. The liking bias is powerful stuff, and
Yeah.
it's usually based on three things. Are they attractive? Are they similar to us? Do they give us compliments?
Ooh, compliments, yeah, those get me every time. Even when I know they're not sincere.
We all like to be flattered, right? But be aware of this bias, especially when making big decisions. Ask yourself, am I being swayed by how much I like this person, or am I making a rational choice?
This is all so, so valuable. I'm starting to see the world through a whole new lens.
That's the power of understanding these biases. Ready for another one?
Bring it on. I feel like I'm getting more self-aware with every bias we unpack.
Okay, let's tackle the endowment effect. This is our tendency to overvalue things we own simply because they're ours.
Is that why people get so attached to their, like, old junk? You know, stuff they never even use anymore?
That's one example. Think about that old t-shirt you can't get rid of, or that beat-up car you think is worth way more than it actually is.
Oh, yeah. One of the articles talked about that with real estate. Sellers often overprice their homes just because they're emotionally attached to them, right?
Classic endowment effect. We just see more value in things we own, even if it's not really there.
So how do we fight this? How do we stop overvaluing our stuff?
Detach yourself. Emotionally, I mean. When you're selling something, get an objective opinion, like from an appraiser. And when you're buying, don't let the seller's emotional attachment sway you. Focus on the actual value of the thing, you know.
Great advice, especially for anyone buying or selling, well, anything really.
Ready for one last bias before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I'm all ears. What have you got?
Let's talk about coincidence. Or rather, our tendency to see meaning in things that are just random. You know, those times when you think of someone and then they call you out of the blue.
Okay, yeah, I love those moments. Feel like a sign, right? Like the universe trying to tell you something.
It can feel that way. But statistically, coincidences happen way more often than we think. One of the articles, it talked about this church that exploded during choir practice. People thought it was some divine act. But when you think about all the churches in the world, all the choirs practicing every week, well, statistically, one of them's bound to explode eventually, just because of bad luck, not because of a message from above.
So it's all about probability.
Exactly. So to avoid misinterpreting these coincidences, try reframing them. See them as just, statistical probabilities, not as signs or messages.
This is a good reminder to stay grounded, not get carried away with wishful thinking and all that.
That's a great place to pause for now, I think. We've covered a lot of ground, and there's still so much more to explore. But remember, just knowing about these biases, you're already ahead of the game.
This deep dive has been, wow, incredible. I can't wait to uncover more of these cognitive biases in part 2.
Welcome back, everyone. Are you ready for round 2 of bias busting? Because we've got a lot more to unpack.
Oh, I am so ready. Part 1 was mind-blowing, honestly. I can't believe how many of these mental traps I've, fallen into without even realizing it.
It happens to the best of us. But hey, awareness is the first step, right? So let's dive back into the fascinating world of cognitive biases, shall we?
Absolutely. What do you have for me? What's next on our agenda?
Okay, let's talk about base rate neglect. This is where we ignore statistics, the actual probabilities, when we're making judgments. One of the sources had this classic example. Imagine a guy named Mark, thin, wears glasses, enjoys Mozart. Is he more likely to be a truck driver or a literature professor in Frankfurt?
Well, I'd probably say literature professor. It just, fits the stereotype, right?
And it's base rate neglect right there. We let those stereotypes cloud our judgment. Statistically, there are way more truck drivers in Germany than literature professors in Frankfurt. So Mark is probably a truck driver, even if he doesn't fit the image we have in our heads.
So our intuition can be totally wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when we're relying on stereotypes or those, one-off stories. To fight base rate neglect, we got to remember the underlying probabilities. Don't let our biases override the actual statistics. Even though you see Teslas everywhere these days, there's still a tiny percentage of all cars on the road.
That's a good point. I'm definitely going to try to be more data-driven in my thinking from now on. What other biases should we be on the lookout for?
Okay, let's talk about groupthink. This is when we just go along with what the group thinks, even if we know it's wrong.
Oh, I've seen this so many times in meetings. No one wants to be the one to disagree or, rock the boat, even if they have serious doubts.
And that's how bad decisions get made. Groupthink often happens when there's pressure to agree, reach a consensus quickly, or if there's a strong leader who doesn't want to hear any dissenting opinions. One of the sources mentioned the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was a classic example of groupthink gone wrong.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary example. So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we make sure we're thinking for ourselves?
Speak up, encourage different opinions. If you're in a meeting and you have doubts, don't be afraid to say something. Ask questions, challenge those assumptions, play devil's advocate. It might feel a little uncomfortable, sure, but it's crucial for making good decisions.
I'm going to try to be more courageous in those group settings. So what's next? What else is on our bias-busting list?
All right, let's talk about neglect of probability. This is our tendency to get swayed by how big or impactful something could be rather than how likely it actually is. Like, imagine you have two gambles. One has a tiny chance of winning a huge jackpot, and the other has a much higher chance of winning a smaller amount. Which one are you drawn to?
Honestly, I'd probably go for the big jackpot, even if the odds are slim. I mean, who doesn't dream of winning big, right?
That's neglect of probability in action. We focus on that potential reward and completely ignore the actual probabilities. This is why lotteries are so popular, even though your chances of winning are, basically zero.
So it's about, being realistic about our chances, not getting carried away with what could happen.
Exactly. When you're making a decision, don't just look at the potential upside. Think about how likely it is that you'll actually succeed or fail. Sometimes a smaller but more certain gain is better than a big but super unlikely one.
Okay, good advice. This is a good reminder to keep my expectations in check. So what else? What other biases should we be aware of?
Let's talk about zero-risk bias. This is our preference for getting rid of a risk completely, even if it's tiny, instead of, reducing a bigger risk.
I'm not sure I get that one. Can you give me an example?
Okay, imagine you have two safety measures. One completely eliminates a 1% chance of a minor injury, and the other one reduces a 10% chance of a major injury down to 5%. Which one would you choose?
I think I'd go for the one that eliminates the risk completely, even though it's a smaller risk. I guess I don't like taking chances.
That's zero-risk bias right there. We want to eliminate risk so badly that we might miss chances to significantly reduce a bigger risk.
So accepting a small risk might actually be the best way to avoid a bigger one.
Sometimes, yeah. It's like wearing a seatbelt. It doesn't eliminate the chance of a car accident, but it drastically reduces the chance of getting seriously hurt.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm starting to see how these biases can affect, all sorts of everyday decisions.
They really do. So, ready to dive into another bias?
Absolutely. My brain is getting a real workout today.
Okay, then let's talk about the scarcity error. This is our tendency to want things more just because they're rare or hard to get.
Oh, like limited edition products or those flash sale deals that only last a couple of hours.
Exactly. Scarcity creates this urgency, makes us think something is more desirable, even if it's not that special.
One of the sources mentioned how some real estate agents use this. They'll make up a story about another buyer being interested just to create this fake sense of scarcity.
Oh, that's a classic example of the scarcity error being used against us.
Yeah.
So how do we avoid falling for it?
I guess by taking a step back and asking ourselves, do I really want this thing? Or am I just caught up in the fact that it's, limited edition or whatever?
Exactly. Remember, scarcity is often manufactured to make us buy stuff. Don't let it control your decisions.
This is a great reminder to, be a smart shopper, Think for myself.
All right, ready for another one?
Hit me with it. What's the next bias on our list?
Let's talk about the gambler's fallacy. This is the mistaken belief that, past events can influence things that are actually random. Think about flipping a coin. If you get heads 5 times in a row, you might think, okay, tails has got to be coming up next. But each flip is independent. The odds are still 50-50.
So even if I get heads 10 times in a row, the next flip is still a coin toss.
Exactly. Past results don't predict future outcomes when it comes to random events. The gambler's fallacy can make people do some crazy things, like betting more after a losing streak, thinking their luck has to change.
Like those people who play the same lottery numbers every week, thinking their numbers are due to hit.
Classic example. To avoid this fallacy, remember each event is independent. The past doesn't dictate the future.
Okay, I'm taking notes. This is good stuff. What's up next on our bias-busting agenda?
Okay, let's talk anchoring. This is our tendency to rely too much on the first piece of information we get, even if it's totally irrelevant. Like, think about negotiating a price for something.
Oh, you mean like when you're buying a used car?
Yeah. The first number that gets thrown out there, even if it's random, can totally anchor the whole negotiation.
So first impressions really matter.
Big time. Especially when it comes to numbers. One study, they had students write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, then bid on a bottle of wine. And guess what? The students with higher numbers bid way more.
No way. Seriously. That's crazy. But it kind of makes sense, like our brains grab onto that first number, even if it's totally random.
Exactly. To avoid anchoring, you have to be aware of the power of those first impressions, especially when it comes to numbers. Don't let a random number dictate what you think something is worth.
This is great advice, especially for anyone who negotiates for a living. So what other biases should we be aware of? What else is on our list?
Let's talk about loss aversion. This is all about how losing something like, say, $100 feels way worse than gaining $100 feels good.
Yeah, no one likes losing money, but it's more than that.
It is. The feeling of loss is stronger, and it can make us do some irrational things, like holding on to investments that are tanking, or refusing to sell a house for less than we paid for it, even if it makes financial sense.
Ooh, yeah, I've been there. Held onto a stock way too long because I couldn't stand the thought of selling at a loss.
We've all done it. The way to fight loss aversion. Be willing to cut your losses, move on. Don't let that fear of loss stop you from making smart decisions.
This is a good reminder to stay objective,
Ah.
Don't let my emotions control my finances. So what's next? What other biases do we need to watch out for?
Let's tackle social comparison bias. This is where we're always comparing ourselves to others, and it usually makes us feel bad. We focus on the people who are doing better than us, which can lead to feeling inadequate or envious.
Oh, I am so guilty of this one, especially with social media. It's easy to get caught up in everyone's highlight reel and feel like everyone else is more successful and happy than I am. It's a trap.
Social media is, yeah, it's a breeding ground for social comparison bias, for sure. But remember, everyone's on their own journey. Don't compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20.
That's a great way to put it. So how do we start comparing ourselves to others? How do we stay focused on our own path?
Celebrate your own wins. Focus on your progress. Don't get caught up in that keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
Okay, you've convinced me. Time to unfollow those accounts that make me feel bad about myself. What else do we have? What other biases should we know about?
Let's talk about the overconfidence effect. This is when we overestimate our abilities, our knowledge. You know those surveys that ask if you think you're a better than average driver?
I had those people say yes.
They do, which is statistically impossible, right?
Yeah.
We can't all be above average. This overconfidence can lead to risky behavior, like taking on projects we're not ready for or making investments we don't understand.
So it's all about being realistic about our limits.
Exactly. Be willing to get feedback, admit what you're not good at, and always be open to learning new things.
Okay, good reminder to stay humble. What's next on the list? What other bias do we need to tackle?
Let's talk about alternative blindness. This is our tendency to only focus on the options we're given, even if there might be better ones out there that we haven't even thought of.
So we're limited by our own imaginations.
Kind of, yeah. We often get stuck in this binary thinking, seeing only 2 choices when there might be a whole bunch more. There's this example, right? A doctor offers a patient risky surgery with a 50-50 chance of survival. But what if there are other, less invasive treatments out there?
So we're trapped in a limited menu of choices and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. This alternative blindness can stop us from making the best decisions. To combat it, think outside the box, explore all the possibilities. Don't be afraid to ask, is there another way?
This is a great reminder to be creative, challenge the status quo.
So, are you ready for another bias deep dive?
Absolutely. I'm loving this journey of self-discovery.
Okay, then let's talk about the forecast illusion. This is our tendency to believe predictions, even though they're usually wrong.
Oh, like those economic forecasts that are always off the mark.
Exactly. Studies show expert predictions are often no better than chance.
Yeah.
But we love that illusion of certainty, right? We want to believe someone out there knows what the future holds.
So basically, be skeptical of anyone who claims to know the future.
It's a good rule of thumb. The future is, well, it's uncertain. Focus on being prepared for different possibilities, not on trying to predict what's going to happen.
This is a great reminder to stay flexible, be ready to adapt, right? So what's next? What other bias do we need to tackle?
Let's talk about the conjunction fallacy. This is our tendency to think specific things are more likely to happen than general things, even though that's, well, logically impossible.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following this one. Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine a guy named Chris. He's an aid worker. Is it more likely that Chris works for a bank, or that Chris works for a bank in New York and has an office on the 24th floor overlooking Central Park?
The second one sounds more, I don't know, more plausible. It's more specific, more
Yeah.
detailed.
but statistically it's less likely. The more specific something is, the less likely it is to actually happen.
So sometimes the simplest explanation is the most accurate.
Often, yeah. To avoid this conjunction fallacy, remember, the chance of two things happening together is always less than or equal to the chance of either one happening alone.
Okay, so think things through logically. Don't get fooled by how detailed a story is. Got it.
Are you ready for another bias deep dive?
Absolutely. My brain is feeling sharper with every bias we uncover.
Okay, then let's talk about framing. This is how we're influenced by the way information is presented, even if the facts are the same. Think about two pieces of meat. One says 99% fat-free, the other says 1% fat.
Oh, I definitely go for the 99% fat-free, even though it's the same thing.
Exactly, that's framing in action. We like things that sound positive, even if they mean the same thing.
So it's all about the spin, how you present the information.
It can be, yeah. Framing is everywhere, from advertising to politics to, even personal relationships. To avoid being manipulated by framing, pay attention to the language, the context. Try to reframe the information in a neutral way. See it objectively.
Okay, so be a critical thinker. Don't just take things at face value. Got it.
Now, are you ready for another bias challenge?
Hit me with it. I'm ready to level up my thinking.
Okay, let's unpack the omission bias. This is our tendency to judge actions that cause harm as worse than inaction that causes the same harm, even though the outcome is the same.
Can you give me a real-world example? I'm not sure I'm following this one.
Sure. Imagine you're a doctor, and you have to decide whether to approve a new drug for patients who are terminally ill. The drug has a 20% chance of killing them immediately, but an 80% chance of saving their life. Do you approve it or withhold it?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think I'd err on the side of caution and withhold the drug. Wouldn't want to be responsible for someone's death.
That's the omission bias. We feel more responsible for actions than for inaction, even if the result is the same. In this case, withholding the drug means 80% of the patients will definitely die, but it feels less wrong than actively giving them a drug that might kill them.
So sometimes doing nothing is just as harmful as doing something.
Exactly. The omission bias is all about remembering to think about both actions and inactions when we're making decisions, especially when there are ethical implications.
This is heavy stuff. But important to think about for sure.
Ready for another bias to ponder?
Yes, absolutely. Bring it on.
Okay, let's talk about the self-serving bias. This is our tendency to, take credit for our successes, but blame external factors for our failures.
Oh, so it's like, I'm awesome when things go well, but it's everyone else's fault when things go wrong.
Exactly.
Whoa.
It helps us feel good about ourselves, but it also stops us from learning from our mistakes.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that happen so many times. People are quick to take credit when the team wins, but when things go south, it's always someone else's fault.
It's a classic human tendency. So to combat the self-serving bias, be honest with yourself about your role in both the good and the bad outcomes. Own your mistakes, learn from them.
This is a good reminder to stay humble and take responsibility, right?
Exactly. Now, ready to dive back into the world of biases?
Absolutely. I'm feeling more self-aware with every bias we uncover.
Okay, let's unpack the hedonic treadmill. This is the idea that we quickly get used to good things in our lives, so our happiness kind of goes back to a baseline,
Oh, like that feeling of getting a new car or a promotion. You're excited at first, but then it wears off and you're back to your usual level of happiness.
Exactly. The hedonic treadmill suggests that real, lasting happiness comes from within, not from external things. It's like that saying, happiness is a journey, not a destination.
So how do we get off this hedonic treadmill? How do we find that lasting happiness?
Focus on gratitude, appreciate what you have, and don't get caught up in always wanting more. More. Focus on experiences, relationships. Those things tend to bring more lasting happiness than material possessions.
Okay, so slow down, enjoy the ride, focus on what really matters. Good advice.
Ready for another bias exploration?
Absolutely. I'm eager to keep learning.
Okay, let's talk about self-selection bias. This is when we draw conclusions from a group of people that isn't really representative of everyone.
Can you give me an example? I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Sure. Imagine you're doing a survey about customer satisfaction, but you only send it to people on your email list. The people who respond are probably either really happy or really unhappy. The folks in the middle, they might be perfectly content, but you wouldn't know it from your survey results.
So it's about making sure you're getting a fair representation of everyone.
Exactly. Self-selection bias can totally skew the results and lead to wrong conclusions. To avoid it, you got to make sure the group you're looking at really represents the bigger picture.
This is a good reminder to Be skeptical of those research findings and look for studies that have a diverse group of people, right?
Absolutely. So, are you ready for another bias to ponder?
Yes. My brain is craving more knowledge.
Okay, then let's talk about the association bias. This is our tendency to connect two events, even if they're not really related.
Oh, like superstitions.
Exactly. Think about a baseball player who always wears... Okay, then let's talk about beginner's luck. This is when we think our early success at something new is because of our skill, even if it was just luck.
Oh, like winning your first hand of poker and thinking you're a natural?
Exactly. Beginner's luck is kind of like a form of that association bias we talked about. We connect our early success with our ability, even if it was just random. This can make us overconfident, lead us to take bigger risks.
So it's a reminder to be careful about those early wins, not get ahead of ourselves.
Right. Remember, success is usually a mix of skill, hard work, and luck. Don't let those early wins blind you to the need to keep learning, keep improving.
This is a good reminder to stay grounded, keep working hard. So what's next? What other bias do we need to understand?
Let's talk about hyperbolic discounting. This is all about how we tend to choose a small reward now instead of a bigger reward later, even if the bigger reward is objectively better.
Oh, so like choosing a slice of cake now instead of like a healthy meal later.
Classic example. Hyperbolic discounting is why we procrastinate, why we make those impulsive decisions. We're so focused on feeling good right now that we sacrifice those long-term goals.
So it's all about learning to delay gratification.
You got it. To fight hyperbolic discounting, try to picture those long-term benefits. Remember, the satisfaction of achieving a big goal often outweighs that quick pleasure of instant gratification.
Okay, so focus on the big picture. Make choices that support those long-term goals. Got it.
Ready to unpack another bias?
Absolutely. I'm feeling more and more like a cognitive scientist with every bias we explore.
Okay, then let's talk about the because justification. This is our tendency to be swayed by arguments that use the word because, even if the reasoning is weak.
Really, just adding the word because makes that much of a difference.
It can, yeah. One of the examples was about people waiting in line for a copy machine. When someone asked to cut in line, they were more likely to get permission if they gave a reason, even if the reason was totally nonsensical.
So we're just suckers for explanations, even if they're bogus.
It seems that way. The because justification shows how easily we can be persuaded by weak arguments, as long as they sound logical.
So how do we avoid falling for this? How do we make sure we're not just being tricked by a word?
Be critical of the reasons you're given. Don't just accept something because it includes the word because. Really think about the logic of the argument itself.
Okay, so think critically. Don't be fooled by superficial justifications. This is great advice.
Ready for another bias challenge?
Absolutely. I'm on a roll today.
Okay, let's talk decision fatigue. This is the idea that our willpower is like a muscle. It gets tired after we make too many decisions. Think about those times when you've been shopping all day, and by the end, you're so exhausted that you buy things you don't even need.
Oh, tell me about it. Decision fatigue is real.
It is, and it affects everything, our work, relationships, even our finances. To fight decision fatigue, simplify your choices, delegate decisions whenever you can, and try to make those big decisions when you're feeling rested and energized.
Okay, so be mindful of my mental energy. Don't make big choices when I'm feeling drained. Got it.
Ready for another bias deep dive?
Bring it on. I'm feeling more and more like a cognitive ninja with every bias we uncover.
All right, let's unpack the contagion bias. This is the irrational belief that something can be contaminated by contact with something else, even if there's no logical reason for it.
Okay, this one sounds interesting. Can you give me an example?
One of the sources talked about how people are often reluctant to wear a sweater that Hitler once owned, even if it's been washed and cleaned a million times.
That's weird. It's like the sweater has some, I don't know, bad energy attached to it, even though it's just a sweater.
Exactly. The contagion bias shows how powerful our emotions and beliefs can be, even when they don't make sense.
So how do we overcome this bias? How do we stop ourselves from feeling this way?
Recognize that it's irrational. Remind yourself that objects don't, absorb the essence of the people who own them. Don't let your emotions control you.
Okay, so be logical. Don't let my feelings run the show. Good advice.
Ready to unpack another bias?
Absolutely. My brain is loving this workout.
Okay, then let's talk about the problem with averages. Averages can be useful, but they can also be misleading, especially when we're dealing with extreme values.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me like a real world example?
Sure. Imagine you're calculating the average wealth of a group of, say, 50 people. Most of them have a net worth of around $50,000. But then Bill Gates joins the group. Suddenly, the average wealth jumps to over $1 billion, even though only one person has that much money.
Ah, I see what you mean. So one super rich person can totally skew the whole average.
Exactly. The problem with averages is that they don't always show us the whole picture, how the data is actually spread out. To avoid being misled, look beyond the average, consider the full range of values.
Okay, so look at the bigger picture, not just one number. Got it.
Ready for another bias deep dive?
Absolutely. I'm feeling more and more like a cognitive detective with every bias we uncover.
Okay, then let's talk about the twaddle tendency. This is our tendency to use way more words than we need to, often to hide the fact that we don't really know what we're talking about.
So it's like using, I don't know, a bunch of fancy words to cover up the fact that you don't have anything meaningful to say.
You got it. The twaddle tendency is common in academia, politics, anywhere where sounding smart is important. To avoid it, be clear, be concise, get to the point. Don't use 10 words when 5 will do.
Okay, so keep it simple, cut the fluff. This is a good reminder to be clear and concise in my communication.
Ready for another bias to explore?
Bring it on. My brain is feeling sharper with every bias we uncover.
Okay, then let's talk about the Will Rogers phenomenon. This is a weird statistical quirk named after Will Rogers, the comedian. He said, when the Okies left Oklahoma and moved to California, they raised the average intelligence level in both states.
Wait, what? How is that possible?
It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense mathematically. Imagine two groups of people, one with a higher average IQ than the other. If you move some of the lower IQ folks from the lower IQ group to the higher IQ group, you'll raise the average IQ in both groups.
Whoa, that's wild. So just by moving people around, you can make it seem like things have improved?
Exactly. The Will Rogers phenomenon shows how statistics can be manipulated to create misleading results.
This is a good reminder to, like, be critical of statistics, look beyond the surface numbers. What other bias do we need to unpack?
Okay, let's talk about effort justification. This is our tendency to value things more if we've put a lot of effort into them, even if they're not actually that great.
Oh, so like staying in a bad relationship because you've already invested so much time and energy?
Perfect example. Effort justification can make us hold on to things that aren't good for us anymore.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap? How do we let go of things that aren't working?
Be willing to cut your losses and move on. Don't let those sunk costs control your future decisions. It's never too late to make a change.
This is a good reminder to be honest with myself, make choices that are good for me, even if it means letting go of something I've invested in. What else do we have? What other bias should we be aware of?
Let's talk about the law of small numbers. This is when we jump to conclusions based on, a small amount of data, even though those conclusions are probably wrong.
So it's all about, like, sample size, right? The importance of statistical significance.
Exactly. The law of small numbers shows how easily we can be tricked by those anecdotal stories and small-scale studies.
Can you give me, like, a real-world example?
Sure. Imagine you're reading a study that claims this new weight loss supplement is super effective, but the study only had 10 people in it. Would you be convinced?
Probably not. 10 people is way too small to draw any real conclusions.
Exactly. To avoid falling for this law of small numbers, look for studies with lots of participants and make sure those participants represent the bigger population. And be careful about those personal stories. Just because something works for one person doesn't mean it worked for everyone.
Okay, so be a critical thinker. Look for evidence-based research, not just anecdotes. Got it.
Ready for another bias deep dive?
Bring it on! I'm feeling more and more like a cognitive master with every bias we uncover.
Okay, let's talk about expectations. This is the idea that what we believe about something can actually influence how we experience it, even if those beliefs aren't true.
Like the placebo effect. If you believe a sugar pill will make you feel better, you might actually start to feel better.
Perfect example. Our expectations are powerful. There was this study where teachers were told that some of their students were about to have this, intellectual growth spurt. Guess what? Those students ended up performing better, even though they were chosen randomly.
Wow. So the teacher's expectations actually changed how the students performed. That's amazing.
It is. So, to use the power of expectations for good, set high expectations for yourself and for others. Believe in your ability to succeed and surround yourself with people who believe in you too.
This is a good reminder to stay positive and surround myself with supportive people. What else do we have? What's the next bias?
Okay, let's talk about symbol logic. Sounds basic,
Yeah.
right? But you'd be surprised how many people struggle with, just basic logical thinking.
You're saying we're not as rational as we think we are.
The evidence suggests that, yeah, maybe not. One of the sources talked about this test, the cognitive reflection test, or the CRT. It measures how well people can, override those gut instincts and actually think things through. And the results weren't, well, they weren't great.
So how to get better at this? How do we improve our logical thinking skills?
Slow down. Think things through carefully. Don't jump to conclusions. Question your assumptions. And be open to changing your mind when you see new evidence.
This is a good reminder to always be a critical thinker, right?
Absolutely. So, ready for another bias to explore?
Absolutely. I'm eager to learn more.
Okay, let's talk about the 4 effect. This is our tendency to believe that, those vague personality descriptions apply specifically to us, even though they could apply to almost anyone. Think about horoscopes or those personality quizzes you see online.
Oh, yeah. Those are always fun. So it's
Those-
like we're looking for confirmation of what we already believe about ourselves.
Exactly. The 4 effect shows how much we want to, understand ourselves, find our place in the world. But to really know yourself, you need more than a vague personality description. Get feedback from people you trust, really reflect on your own experiences, and be open to learning new things about yourself.
This is a great reminder to be careful about what I'm reading and to really seek out, authentic self-knowledge. What other bias do we have to unpack today?
Let's talk about volunteer's folly. This is the idea that sometimes our efforts to help others can actually backfire.
Wait, what? How can volunteering be a bad thing?
It's not that volunteering is bad. It's about being strategic.
Mm.
Using your time and resources in the most effective way. One of the sources used the example of a really talented photographer who volunteers to take pictures at a charity event. He spends hours shooting and editing, but because of that, he knows a paid photography gig. Wouldn't it have been better for him to work the paid gig and then donate some of his earnings to the charity?
Yeah, I see your point. Sometimes it's better to contribute our skills and resources in a way that has a bigger impact.
Exactly. Volunteer's folly is all about considering the opportunity cost of our time and effort. Are we really making the biggest difference we can?
Okay, so be mindful of how I can use my skills and resources to make a real difference. What's the next bias on our list?
Let's talk about the affect heuristic. This is our tendency to make judgments based on how we feel rather than, logic and reason.
So, making decisions based on gut feeling.
Exactly. The affect heuristic shows just how powerful emotions are in our decision-making. We might make a snap judgment based on how we feel in the moment without really thinking about the facts or what might happen as a result.
So how do we stop our emotions from hijacking our decision making?
Be aware of your emotional state. Try to make big decisions when you're feeling calm and rational. It's like that advice about never going grocery shopping when you're hungry. You're more likely to make impulsive choices.
That's a great analogy. Okay, what's next on our bias busting adventure? What other bias do we need to be aware of?
Let's talk about the introspection illusion. This is our tendency to think that we know our own thoughts and motivations better than anyone else, even though that's often not true.
Oh, I am so guilty of this. I always think I have a pretty good handle on why I do the things I do.
We all do. But research suggests that our self-perceptions are often flawed. There was one study, right? They asked people to choose between 2 photos of faces and then explain why they liked one better. The researchers secretly switched the photos, and most people didn't even notice. They kept on justifying their choice, even though they were now talking about a completely different face.
Whoa, that's trippy. So our brains are basically making up stories to explain our choices, even if those stories are totally wrong.
It seems that way. So to fight the introspection illusion, be open to feedback from others, especially people who know you well. They might see things you don't.
Okay, so stay humble, get different perspectives. Got it. What else is on our list? What other bias do we need to be aware of?
Let's talk about the inability to close doors. This is our tendency to keep all of our options open, even if it means we're spreading ourselves too thin and can't focus on anything properly.
Oh, this is me. I always have a million tabs open on my computer. My to-do list is a mile long. I just can't say no.
It's a common struggle. But this inability to close doors can lead to feeling overwhelmed, being indecisive, and just not making any progress. To fight it, figure out what your priorities are. Learn to say no to things that don't align with those priorities, and focus on completing one task at a time.
This is a great reminder to simplify, Focus on what really matters. What other biases are lurking out there in our minds?
Okay, let's talk about neomania. This is our obsession with novelty, our tendency to always want the newest thing, even if it's not actually better.
Oh, so like always having to have the latest gadget or the newest fashion trend.
Exactly. Neomania drives consumerism, that constant desire for something new. But it can lead to a cycle of, never being satisfied. We're always chasing the next shiny object, never really appreciating what we have.
So how do we overcome this bias? How do we break free from that cycle?
Practice gratitude. Take time to appreciate what you have. Resist that urge to constantly upgrade, get more stuff. Focus on experiences, relationships. Those are the things that bring real, lasting happiness.
Okay, slow down, appreciate what I have, focus on experiences, not things. This is good stuff.
Ready for another deep dive?
Bring it on. I'm feeling more and more like a cognitive guru with every bias we uncover.
All right, let's unpack the sleeper effect.
All right.
This is our tendency to, you know, become more persuaded by an argument over time, even if we initially thought it was bogus.
Really? Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Imagine you see a political ad and you're like, nope, not buying it. But weeks later, you might start to remember some of the points from that ad and find them more convincing, even though you completely forgot that you dismissed them at first.
So it's like the source of the information fades from memory, but the message sticks around.
Exactly. To avoid falling for the sleeper effect,
Mm-hmm.
always remember where you got the information and really think about the message. Even if it sounds familiar or convincing, don't let repetition fool you.
This is a great reminder to be like a vigilant consumer of information, Fact check everything.
Now, are you ready for our final bias exploit?
I'm ready to face my final cognitive boss. What have you got?
Let's talk about the primacy and recency effects. These are our tendencies to remember the first and last things in a list better than the things in the middle.
So first impressions and grand finales are the most memorable.
You got it. These effects show how important it is to, frame things the right way, present information strategically. If you want someone to remember something, put it at the beginning or the end of your message.
Wow, this is great advice for like public speaking. I'm definitely going to make sure my introductions and conclusions are super strong from now on.
It's a great strategy.
Wow, we have covered so much ground today. Thank you so much for taking me on this incredible journey through the world of cognitive biases. I feel like I've learned so much about how my brain works, and more importantly, how to outsmart my own mental traps.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
Remember, the key is awareness. Knowing about these biases is the first step to making better decisions.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today? What should they remember?
Just because these biases are common, it doesn't mean we're stuck with them. By understanding these mental shortcuts, how they affect our thinking, we can make smarter, more informed choices. It's like having, a secret decoder ring for your own mind.
That's a perfect way to put it. So, listeners, your homework is to pay attention to your own thoughts over the next few days. See if you can spot any of these biases in action. You might be surprised at what you find. And remember, a little self-awareness can go a long way. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into cognitive biases.